Born August 11, 1967 in Newark, New Jersey, Joseph James Rogan started on his destined path as an early teenager picking up martial arts, recalling his earlier years as being spent, quote, terrified of being a loser. Martial arts just gave me not just confidence, but also a different perspective of myself and what I was capable of. It was the first thing that ever gave me hope that I wasn't going to be a loser. At 14, he took up karate, moving into taekwondo a year later, and at 19, he won the US Open Championship Taekwondo tournament in the lightweight division, and for 4 consecutive years, Rogan held the Massachusetts Full Contact State Championship and actually became a taekwondo instructor. However, at age 21, he resigned from participating in his sports as frequent headaches created fear he may sustain extreme injuries. Initially considering a full-time career in kickboxing, stand-up comedy wasn't even a thought. However, he did certainly enjoy comedy, and it wasn't until his friends at the local gym urged him to try his hand at stand-up, as he was constantly making them laugh with his unique jokes and impressions. After 6 months of harsh preparation, Rogan gave his debut performance at the Stitches Comedy Club in Boston on August 27, 1988. While living in Boston and perfecting his stand-up routine, Rogan held down multiple jobs to sustain him. This included a newspaper delivery route, construction work, a limousine driver, and even a private investigator's assistant, performing his comedy routine at bachelor parties and strip clubs whenever he could get an in. This was until one night he convinced talent manager Jeff Sussman to allow him 5 minutes on stage at a big-name Boston comedy club. Now, Sussman enjoyed his act so much, he offered to become his manager, which Rogan of course accepted. In 1990, Rogan would venture to New York City as a full-time comedian, staying with his grandfather for the first 6 months as he was, quote, scratching and grinding for money. It wouldn't be until 1994 that Rogan relocated to Los Angeles and really started to make it big. His first appearance on national TV was on the MTV show Half Hour Comedy Show. This appearance would lead to offers from the network for a 3-year exclusive contract and a role in the pilot episode of a, quote, dopey game show for only $500. Rogan, under Sussman's management, declined the offer, but with the interest of a major network piqued, his manager Sussman sent out tapes of Rogan's performance to several networks, which, in turn, sparked a bidding war for the new comedic talent in LA. After a negotiation period, Rogan landed his first major acting role in 1994, a 9-episode Fox sitcom known as Hardball, where Rogan would play Frank Valenti, an egocentric MVP player on a professional baseball team. Rogan recounts this wasn't the best experience, stating, and I quote, "It was a great show on paper until a horrible executive producer with a big ego was hired by Fox to run the show, and he actually rewrote it." During this time, however, Rogan began performing at the Comedy Store in Hollywood, and was eventually hired as a paid regular by the owner Mitzi Shore. He would perform at the club for the next 13 years for free, even paying for the venue's new sound system out of his own pocket. Between 1995 and 1999, Rogan would star in the NBC sitcom News Radio as Joe Gorelli, a handyman and electrician at the show's fictitious news radio station. And while this role was originally intended to be played by none other than Ray Romano, the decision to hire Rogan instead happened after the very first rehearsal, with the directors believing Rogan would be a better fit. This switch actually caused Rogan to directly interact with the show's writers to develop the character of Gorelli, which Rogan later described as a, quote, very dumbed down, censored version of himself. Rogan described this stretch in his life as a, quote, dream gig, as it allowed him to continue working on his stand-up routine while also receiving a full-time income from the sitcom. It wouldn't actually be until 1997, after watching the Royce Gracie UFC 2 fight, that Rogan would take a serious interest in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and become a post-fight and backstage interviewer for the Ultimate Fighting Championship. When the UFC was taken over by President Dana White in 2001, he was actually offered a job as a color commentator. While Rogan would initially decline the offer, he would accept it upon the second offering in 2002 when Dana enticed Rogan to commentate on fights in exchange for prime event tickets for him and his friends. After commentating on 15 different fights, Rogan finally accepted a salary for his work and sat alongside Mike Goldberg in the booth until the end of 2016. Actually winning Wrestling Observer Newsletter Award for Best Television Announcer twice and MMA Personality of the Year 4 times. In 1999, Rogan secured a 3-album deal with Warner Bros. Records for his own primetime series on Fox, known as The Joe Rogan Show. This show, co-written by Seinfeld writer Bill Masters, wanted to feature Rogan as the token male on a View-style women's show. This show led Rogan to find even more national exposure, ultimately ending in 2001 as he accepted an offer from NBC to host an American adaptation of Fear Factor. Now initially, he did decline the role, believing that this show would go nowhere as the network wouldn't actually air the content found within Fear Factor, for it was a bit extreme. Eventually, his manager would convince him into the role, and running from 2001 to 2006, Fear Factor would prove to be yet another stepping stone for the young actor to find national recognition. Now unknown to most, Rogan actually made a first attempt at hosting his own radio show in 2004 during the Fear Factor years. However, due to his extremely busy schedule, nothing actually came of this attempt. Concentrating so heavily on film and acting left Rogan feeling uninspired to work on his true passion, comedy, and with the money he had already earned from his television ventures, he hired 2 full-time people to go along and film him and his comedy friends on their own tour, releasing clips on his website for the new Joe Show web series. In 2005, he would sign a deal with the Endeavor Talent Agency, and only 2 months later would film the comedy special Joe Rogan Live in Phoenix, Arizona, with a large premiere on the Showtime network 2 years later in 2007. Rogan would follow this comedic tour until 2009, where he would host the short-lived CBS series Game Show in My Head, which only aired 8 episodes. A simple show which explored the limits people would place themselves under for an ever-increasing cash prize. Rogan called this venture, quote, a completely mindless form of entertainment. And in 2011, he would return to Fear Factor to film its final season. In December of 2009, Rogan would launch his free podcast with Brian Redban, a friend and fellow comedian. By August 2010, the podcast would be named The Joe Rogan Experience and entered the list of top 100 podcasts on iTunes. In 2011, the podcast would actually be picked up by SiriusXM satellite radio, featuring a wide array of guests to discuss current events, politics, philosophy, MMA, comedy, and more. By January 2015, the Joe Rogan Experience had reached over 11 million downloads, jumping quickly as only a few months later it would reach 16 million downloads, making it one of the most popular free podcasts in the world. After wrestling with his main streaming service YouTube, Rogan would go on to sign a $200 million deal with Spotify in 2020, one of the largest licensing agreements in the podcast space. From scratching and grinding to survive, Joe Rogan was now a multi-millionaire podcast host with notoriety in both the acting and commentating world as well. He became a co-founder of On It, the supplement and fitness company, and occasionally advertises the brand on his podcast. While Rogan often finds himself at the center of widespread controversy, millions of individuals tune in each week to hear the intriguing, exciting, and often far from center discussions that occur live on air.